Okay, now we'll get started with Myanmar, and our speaker and group leader today is Ed Johnson, and Ed received a BA from DePaul University, and he worked for the Indianapolis Department of Metropolitan Development and the Indiana Department of Transportation. And in recognition for his services and right of, I'm sorry, I can't talk or read this morning. In Department of Transportation in relocation services and right-of-way acquisition. He is retired now and is interested in international affairs and in assistance for refugees. So please help me welcome Ed Johnson.
Good morning. I want to go into the subject of Myanmar a little bit. Myanmar used to be known as Burma. It has 54 million people in an area of 262,000 square miles. Texas has an area of 269,000 square miles. It's bordered by Bangladesh and India to the northwest, China on the northeast, Laos and Thailand on the east and southeast, and the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal on the south and southwest. Its capital is Naypyidaw. In 1962, a military coup held power, came into being in Myanmar, and it held power for nearly 50 years. I also point out that Myanmar got its independence from Britain in 1948. In the 2020 election, Aung San Suu Kyi's party won parliamentary elections. In February 2021, the Burmese military, otherwise known as the Tatmadaw, seized power in a coup d'etat, and the military arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and put her in prison where she is today. There are various ethnic groups in Myanmar. 55% of the people are called Burmans, hence the name of Burma. Han Chinese represent about 20% of the inhabitants, and the Karen 9.5%. I think we've got some Karen in Indianapolis, and a group called the Shan, about 7%. Repression and imprisonment continue in Myanmar to this day after the coup of February 2021. The presiding junta chief is Min Aung Hlaing in Myanmar. And in April 21, there was a special ASEAN summit. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And they developed a 5-point consensus. One is the cessation of violence in Myanmar. Secondly, constructive dialogue for a peaceful solution of conflicts. Naming a special envoy by ASEAN to facilitate mediation. ASEAN is to provide humanitarian assistance, and ASEAN's special envoy is to visit Myanmar to meet with the conflicting parties. On August 4 last year, Erwan Yosef was selected to make a visit. He's from Brunei. He's second Minister of Foreign Affairs in Brunei. This visit has not happened because the junta in Myanmar would not let him meet with the imprisoned Aung San Suu Kyi. On May 12 and May 13, tomorrow on the day after, the White House will host a special summit with heads of states from ASEAN. Its objectives are to find ways to increase cooperation and exchange views on regional and international issues of common interest and concern. From the day the five-point consensus was signed, Min Aung Hlaing, the junta chief, has never acted in good faith or shown genuine interest in honoring it. Instead, only a few days after the consensus was reached, the junta humiliated the 10-member regional bloc by mocking the consensus as a mere suggestion and subsequently refusing to grant permission to the ASEAN special envoy at the time from Brunei to visit the country. The junta continues to blatantly ignore repeated requests from the new ASEAN special envoy from Cambodia to meet with members of the ousted civilian government. This year, the junta handed down a 5-year sentence for Aung San Suu Kyi to remain in prison under falsified charges of corruption. The opinion of this writer, who's been a humanitarian volunteer in Myanmar for 30 years, is that the Myanmar military's violation of the five-point consensus underscores the need for Washington to go beyond the ASEAN framework by abandoning the failed plan and instead using the special summit as a platform to convince ASEAN partners to agree to a new multilateral strategy ASEAN is now scrambling to organize a regional consultation on humanitarian aid distribution in Myanmar through its humanitarian center known as AHA. The opinion of this writer is that Washington should not support the AHA Center being involved in aid coordination and delivery because it would require the junta's approval and oversight, and it would give the current junta cover to carry on its violation of human rights in Myanmar. The Biden administration should roll back support for the failed ASEAN consensus and insist on a new approach to humanitarian aid distribution through the community-based organizations and civil society networks operating along the Thai-Myanmar and India-Myanmar borders. This has been promoted by Myanmar civil society organizations and rights groups over the past year. The United States should also push to urgently broaden the current sanctions on Myanmar to include a ban on the sale and transfer of arms and jet fuel to the junta, because the junta has consistently launched indiscriminate and deliberate attacks on civilian targets. The U.S. ASEAN Special Summit of this week represents a vital opportunity for the Biden administration to advance a Myanmar policy that can meaningfully address the ongoing crisis. Every day that such a response is delayed is another day of bloodshed and devastation for the millions of defenseless citizens suffering under the brutal military junta. That's the end of my presentation. I guess we'll see we'll look at the screen now.
Well, we'll go ahead and show the DVD, and then there will be question and answer period after that. So, thank you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. Today we reached the midway point in this 9-lecture master class by turning our attention to topic number 5, Myanmar and ASEAN. ASEAN is a political and economic alliance in Southeast Asia. It today faces a great challenge in Myanmar, where a coup d'etat has installed a military dictatorship, and ASEAN has been called upon to address it. But the alliance's challenges are significantly more than internal, because the major power surrounding and to the north of ASEAN is the People's Republic of China. Here you can see Myanmar in red. It is on the western edge of the ASEAN alliance, a very long border to the north and east with China. And this shows us the ASEAN alliance and its 10 member states. China to the north has made significant claims to the South China Sea, well beyond that which is considered normal or acceptable under prevailing international law. And in many ways, not only China's military rise of late, but also its extended claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea have served to unify the ASEAN members against it. Before we can consider U.S. foreign policy actions relating to Myanmar and ASEAN, we should first consider Myanmar itself, followed by the ASEAN alliance, and then finally take into consideration the various regional dynamics at play as it relates to the crisis in Myanmar. First, we begin with Myanmar. As you can see, it was part of the old British Empire. At the time, the most dominant political force in the world, the United Kingdom in the 19th century, leading into World War I, had vast territorial claims across the international arena, including Burma, which is present-day Myanmar. Myanmar was occupied by the Japanese during World War II, and here you can see on the left-hand side a graph showing the amphibious landing and penetration into Myanmar by Japanese military forces. There was a concerted Allied effort to take Myanmar back from Japan. The numbers. Myanmar became an independent, recognized nation in 1948. That puts it into the category of newly independent countries. It is roughly the size of the great state of Texas, with 57 million people. The vast majority of which are Burman, and the overwhelming majority in terms of religious belief are Buddhist. The per capita income of $5,142 is not very impressive. This is a poor country. In terms of ethnic groups, the dominant group would be the Burmans. You can see them in areas marked in white. Others, such as the Karen, the Chin, among others, are designated by color on this map. What is not shown are the Rohingya people. They are roughly 1 million in size, although the numbers vary greatly depending on one's source. They are Muslim, which sets them apart, and since 2016, they have been the subject of a genocide. The allegation of genocide, of course, is very significant. It is the targeting with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a person or people based upon any of a number of characteristics, including religion and ethnicity. So when the international community says genocide is happening in Myanmar, this is a serious allegation. As the violence has unfolded, the Rohingya have moved out of the state, fled, as you can see from this graph, into neighboring countries up to Bangladesh, but predominantly to Indonesia and Malaysia, creating a refugee crisis. On a separate note, Myanmar is also troubled by the fact that it is considered the world's meth lab, with significant amounts of illicit drugs being produced in-country and shipped abroad. Let's take a look at the leadership of Myanmar since its independence in 1948. At that point, it was a monarchy. The king was in power. He was assassinated in 1962 when the military made a coup d'etat, taking power and keeping it throughout the Cold War and well into the 21st century. Democracy arrived in Myanmar in 2011. It lasted until 2021, when yet another coup d'etat occurred, returning the country to military leadership. Let's look at the democracy of Myanmar. Most people associate it with one person, Aung San Suu Kyi. She is the recipient of the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize because she was the leader of the resistance movement to the military. She was the face of the resistance, living under house arrest year after year. In 2015, she became the head of government. She could not assume the title of president or prime minister because that was expressly forbidden in the constitutional changes made back in 2011. The military clearly feared her. She has been, however, silent on the Rohingya genocide, at one point stating there's violence on both sides, which is a way of saying that, well, the Rohingya are being targeted, but for just reason. They have exhibited acts of violence, and the state of Myanmar is simply returning that violence upon them. The coup d'etat that took place in 2021 has its origins in the 2020 national election, the results of which were going to be certified in 2021 with a swearing-in ceremony. One day before that ceremony, the military made its move, arresting leaders who had been elected for a variety of offenses, including campaign law violations and violations of COVID measures in Myanmar. Over the course of the next month and a half, over 700 civilians were killed and more than 3,000 were detained. These numbers only increased throughout 2021. The ASEAN Alliance, the organization of states that should play a role in resolving the crisis in Myanmar. You can see from this graph, it is geographically located in Southeast Asia. It was established in 1967. Its membership has nearly doubled to 10 by 2022, and it promotes social, economic, and military cooperation among its member states. Its mission has evolved. Back in 1967, it was limited in membership largely because of its desire to counter neighboring Vietnam, the emerging power in Southeast Asia. It talked a great deal about multinational cooperation on a wide range of issues, which is, of course, its primary focus today as well. But in the mid-1990s, the mission of ASEAN changed to countering not Vietnam, but China, and for that reason, Vietnam was allowed to join the very organization that was created to counter its growth in power. Such is the nature of world politics. Alliances have one common problem relating to internal strife. So here we show a graph of a dominant power. It could be regional or international, and then a handful of smaller nations, each one of them vulnerable should the larger nation decide to invade it. For a matter of deterrence, they bind themselves together in a formal or informal alliance. An attack on one will be considered an attack upon all, and in so doing, they create a balance of power. Other nations, of course, can join if those who are currently members accept them, further strengthening the balance against the larger country. If, however, there's a problem within the alliance, such as Myanmar today, the tendency is to prioritize the original mission of the alliance, countering the large party, as opposed to dealing with problems inside of it. We saw this with NATO in 1974 when Turkey invaded Cyprus. And we're seeing it today with ASEAN addressing the crisis in Myanmar, simply sweeping it under the rug. The violence in Myanmar is significant. Undoubtedly, people are suffering, and the military coup has not been well received by the general public. It has caused people to leave their homes for safety, to flee across the nation and cross international boundaries. So let's now look at the regional dynamics at play. First, we'll start with ASEAN. How has it responded to the crisis in Myanmar? It issued what it called a 5-point consensus. All of the members of ASEAN agreed on 5 basic points, 3 of which are noteworthy. The call for a cessation of violence, appointment of a special envoy. An envoy is someone selected by a head of state, an organization, or an alliance to be the point person of communication, of contact, and negotiation on a particular issue. We, for example, have special envoys for countries, for regions, or even for themes. Myanmar, of course, the crisis with ASEAN, deserved a special envoy, someone who could speak between Myanmar and the ASEAN alliance. And finally, ASEAN promoted humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of the people of Myanmar. There was, however, no call for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, who is back under house arrest. This is an example of sweeping a problem under the rug. This is not a strong action. This is not collective action with a specific intent, except to be able to publicly claim we're dealing with this issue and we've done all that we can do. Let's look at the influential actors in a region. If we were to divide them into 3 categories, from most important and impacting at the top to least important and impacting at the bottom, ASEAN would go there, along with the United Nations. This is an alliance that has chosen not to get deeply involved, and an organization that has very few options at its disposal. In our middle category of moderately influential countries, I would put Japan, the United States, the UK, and the European Union. Their economic power is substantial. If they decided in concert to economically punish those responsible for the coup in Myanmar, it would certainly have a significant impact. But at the very top is Australia. It is a regional power. It is one that has enormous influence in Southeast Asia and with Myanmar. So how has Australia responded to the coup? Forcefully or in a more reserved fashion? It is the latter, acting more like ASEAN in its response, which effectively takes Australia out of the calculation. So let's now look at American foreign policy options. First and foremost, we are a very great distance from Myanmar, more than 8,500 miles. Americans do not prioritize Myanmar. Very few are familiar with the situation that's happening in Southeast Asia, and the United States does not have a long history of investment or engagement in Myanmar. China, on the other hand, shares a common border with Myanmar that's more than 1,300 miles long. So clearly, among the major powers, China is the most influential. Let's take a look then at China. The most influential actor, the leader of that region, a country that is deeply concerned about the anti-China sentiment that is bubbling over in Myanmar. Many in the resistance movement, in the general public, believe that China was behind the 2021 coup d'etat, that it gave a green light because it preferred the military leadership over the elected leadership of Myanmar. There has been a spike in anti-China crime, and that will likely continue, given the sentiment of the people of Myanmar. China is also very concerned about an explosion of COVID on that long common border. After all, if people are out protesting, if they're congregating in large areas, that is a recipe for COVID expansion, and that is not what China wants. And finally, China has to be concerned about the economic corridor that it has established through Myanmar that could be jeopardized by violence in the country. China has tended to prefer elected officials in countries that it deals with. The reason for that is rather straightforward. When China approaches a country about economic engagement, it tends to ask, what do your people need? If it's light rail or a port system, if it's telecommunications, if it's a psychiatric ward or a rum factory. I mean, the whole range of options. The Chinese are going to provide it, either through long-term low-interest loans, technical supports, or state-to-state grants. And what the Chinese are doing are building strong relations with publics, with the various members of the public of the countries they engage in. And so they're concerned about a coup d'etat that they are going to be blamed for, whether or not they have a role to play in it. Here you can see the economic corridor. It is part of the much larger Chinese design on global economic expansion. It runs through Myanmar on its way to Bangladesh and India. U.S. relations with Myanmar have risen and fallen, falling during the time of the late military leadership in the early 2000s, rising significantly when democracy arrived in 2011, and then tapering off with the recent coup d'etat. The underlying context of American foreign policy calculations, we don't have any vital interests that are at risk in Myanmar. A military response is extraordinarily unlikely, in part because of the region and our experience in Vietnam, but more importantly because there probably isn't a military solution to Myanmar, and certainly not one that we would pursue. Economic blockades, cyber attacks are probably out a bit over the top. Targeted economic sanctions make a lot of sense, raising the cost of those who committed the act of the coup. But we're certainly not going to be willing to attach America's reputation to what happens ultimately in Myanmar. We've been burned in this country before. The Obama administration invested a great deal of energy and attention towards Myanmar. You can see Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in-country visit when the military decided that it would allow for a peaceful transition of power. We took away our economic sanctions and upgraded our diplomatic presence in the country. So the Obama administration was invested in turning Myanmar from a military government to a democracy in hopes of aligning with it as part of this pivot towards Asia. We've now been burned to some extent by the 2021 coup. So what exactly is our foreign policy path? Well, we should probably act in concert with other major powers, including the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, Australia, perhaps India. India could be an amazingly influential power if it wanted to in Myanmar. To date, it has not indicated a willingness to do so. A lot of risks for India. It is reluctant to attach its reputation to the outcome of this coup d'etat. Targeted economic sanctions, targeted travel sanctions, and targeted social sanctions could all be employed by these major economic powers against those responsible for the military coup. Probably not going to result in any significant change, given that most of those in charge in Burma are deeply invested in their country and in the government that they now are controlling. We will very likely pursue a policy of some suspended aid. We do want to be careful here because much of the aid that we send to Myanmar, even though it's channeled through government offices, makes its way to the people of the country. There is the reality of aid leakage. Anytime that we make a donation to a targeted group within a country, it is going to be distributed by the national government and state institutions. Along the way, people will take a cut. We lose anywhere from 10 to 40% of targeted aid because of this phenomenon of leakage. And while many people argue that we should probably stop donating if the aid is going to be siphoned off into deep pockets, as the most generous country in the world, the United States probably does not want to raise the expectation level so high on aid delivery. There's just a simple reality that it is the cost of doing business. So if we are going to suspend aid, we have to be very careful such that we don't punish the very people of Myanmar who we're trying to assist. We can also dangle some carrots in front of the military leadership of Myanmar. There are things that they want and that we can offer. It would take some direct communication to clearly identify them and then set the conditions for those rewards being offered. I'm not sure at all that we can be willing to offer enough to make any sort of transition back to democracy possible in Myanmar. The violence continues. The protests go on unabated. The body bags, of course, are piling up. We should think about broadening the focus beyond just Myanmar. I mean, that is the crisis, that is the focus of this great decisions topic, but so is the alliance that surrounds it, that includes Myanmar. So let's take a look at the ASEAN alliance and America's relationship with it. In 2021, ASEAN held its annual summit. President Biden was invited, and he did attend. He made a $100 million pledge in aid to ASEAN members. This aid was designed to support health care spending, promote the climate initiative, education, and economic recovery in the post-COVID era. We spoke in an earlier lecture about the 3 levels of foreign policy challenges that we can place great decisions upon. At the highest level are existential threats, the ones that alter the trajectory of history. Then there are the routine high politics issues that occupy easily 90% of our foreign policy makers' time, energy, and planning. And then finally are the low politics, promotion of democracy abroad, engaging with smaller powers, and promoting human rights and dignity. It is not to say that low politics don't matter, but it is to say foreign policy makers look at them as tertiary concerns. Myanmar falls in that category. It is a small power. We're dealing with issues of democracy and human rights. It is not on the front burner of the Biden administration. I want to thank you for attending this lecture, encourage you to stay engaged, and make great decisions.
Okay, we will have our questions and answer. Ed, you want to come up to the podium again? I'm just going to hand out the microphone. You're the one that has to answer the questions. Okay, so questions. I'll give you the microphone in the order that I see your hands go up, and John is first.
What raw materials, or oil, the strategic metals that Miramar has, what do they have that would be valuable to the United States, China, and so on?
There's not a lot of strategic materials. They have rubies. They produce a lot of rice. I can't think of much basic metal mining there. Does anyone else have a knowledge of that? I don't have any further answer.
10 people, now there's 11. Australia just signed on for like economic war.
Economic war?
Yeah,
With whom?
with Asean.
So you're saying 11 countries
Yeah,
are at war
no,
economically?
no, Asean. Australia's part of Asean.
They added an 11th country?
Yes,
Which one?
Australia.
Australia.
What is the population growth in Miramar and that area of the world? How fast population growth is it?
Well, there's various estimates of present population of 54 to 57 million. I haven't seen any figures about how much it increases. Maybe 2 or 3% a year.
The geography of Myanmar is very strange. How did it get that way? And when did it become Myanmar instead of Burma? If you would, can you tell us how the geography of Myanmar came to be?
I'm not sure I can.
The last part of that is easier. That was just what?
They became Myanmar in 1948, I guess. Independence from England.
From Burma to Myanmar.
Yeah.
Wasn't that later, like just 15 or 20 years ago? Well, anyway,
Their independence was in 1948 now.
okay. And there's, okay, we have Mother who is going to be talking on some stuff that's pretty related to this next week.
Actually, I wanted to offer a little bit about the geography of the country. It's essentially covered from the Himalaya Mountains, from the north border of Burma, all the way down just about to the ocean, with increasingly high, steep valley, deep valleys and steep ridges. It's extremely difficult to progress from east to west in Burma.
Myanmar. Same thing.
We all went to Burma.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, Randy?
I wonder if you have any insights about why did so many people from Myanmar end up on the south side of Indianapolis?
Oh!
Is that the Karen people?
Yeah.
The
Chins.
Chins? Well, one thing, they got, a few of them came and the South Side organized groups that gave them heavy support and encouragement. And people they knew back home heard it was desirable here and they moved here. That'd be my guess.
And I think that's been pretty successful. I think it's worked out well for Indianapolis and for them.
Just a comment about in the newspaper, the Star this morning, it said that Perry Meridian High School, what was it, the volleyball team, 13 out of the 15 members of the team are Burmese.
Amazing.
Okay, very good. Any other questions or comments? First, If not, oh, yes, we have.
I was just surprised at how much money.
Well, just a minute, I'll bring you the microphone. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Just a comment, I had no idea about the amount of money that was not, that was siphoned off by people, you know. I had no idea that that happened when we were donating. Things are not donating, but giving to them.
Foreign aid.
Yeah.
I've heard that for a long time. Some of it gets siphoned
Never
off.
do that.
Some people use that as a basis for saying there shouldn't be any foreign aid, but I don't agree with that.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody on the, just a minute, Ed, don't go away here, we got a gift for you. I want to take this opportunity to thank Ed and everyone on the Great Decisions Committee. The Great Decisions, as most of you know, in the past, we would usually get professors and other people to talk, but this year we had these DVDs, and we decided to make it more difficult for our committee members, and our committee members have spent lots of time preparing for to talk with the DVDs here. And so I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you, Ed. Thank you very much. And there's a gift, our Shepherd Center, and that's a good folder.